Some time ago, I had a podcast with an academic on the Solomon Atah podcast, and we threw around some ideas and we're talking about statecraft. And it kept me thinking because I'd come up with some questions, and those questions, there was the word industrial sovereignty. What is, or what would be what would industrial sovereignty represent? And why nations that do not produce cannot be free? And of course, in that conversation, we didn't really talk about industrial sovereignty. We talked about something else. And while we were talking about something else, and after the podcast had been done, it kept me thinking. I started thinking and I kept thinking about it. And this is a while back, almost at the beginning of the year 2026. And I kept thinking about the hierarchy in the modern world, and that this hierarchy is not written in constitutions. This hierarchy is not announced in diplomatic speeches, but it governs the fate of nations. So industrial sovereignty became very strong in my mind, and I started developing some ideas around it. Some countries design the machines, some countries manufacture the machines, some countries assemble these machines, and most countries simply buy the machines. This hierarchy determines wealth, power, and autonomy. So an autonomous person, and I think within the context of autonomy, you can see that sovereignty is a very important attribute to that. Because in the modern world, sovereignty is not merely political, it is industrial. So let's talk about industrial sovereignty. A nation that cannot produce what it consumes does not truly govern itself. It negotiates its own survival. Think about it. Today, I want to explore a simple but unsettling idea. Industrial sovereignty is the real foundation of freedom. And it begins not with nations, but with individuals, you as a person. At its basic level, sovereignty begins with the capacity to produce. If a person cannot produce anything, that person must depend on others for his own or her own survival. Food must come from somewhere else, tools must come from somewhere else, knowledge must come from somewhere else. You are completely dependent on this, whatever this somewhere else is. Production is the first form of autonomy. So to produce is to be autonomous. The ancient farmer who could grow his own crops possessed a certain form of sovereignty. The artisan who could shape wood or forge metal possessed another. But of course, in the modern economy, many people live entirely as consumers. Many people in the modern economy live entirely as consumers, but that can work for one or two items that you need. But as a person, as a nation, this can become really a negotiation for survival. They consume technology they do not understand. They use software they cannot build. They depend on systems they cannot repair. Think about that. The result is a quiet erosion of personal agency, and this can happen from a person and as can happen to a nation. Industrial sovereignty, even at the personal level, begins with a simple question. What do you produce? Now, what do you consume? Not what do you consume, or not what can you distribute, what do you produce? If this logic applies to individuals, it applies even more strongly to nations. The global economy operates through a hierarchy of production. Think about China. We refer to China in passing as the world's workshop, as the world industry, or as the world manufacturer. The global economy really operates through production. Who is producing what? At the top are the nations that design technology, they control patents, research laboratories, and the scientific knowledge. Below them are nations that manufacture advanced goods. They build the machines that power the world. Just keep thinking about it. These countries build the machines that power the world. Below them are nations that assemble products that they are designed elsewhere. And at the bottom are nations that mainly import finished goods. Where do you buy your clothes? Do you get a local tailor, a local designer to design your own clothes? Or do you have to only buy clothes that are imported? Where do you buy the things you use at home? Do you produce some of them? Very simple questions which I believe that we can engage with and start to understand the core ideas around sovereignty, personal sovereignty, industrial sovereignty. And at the very bottom, if you have to import everything, finished goods, and when you cannot import them, what does that mean? This hierarchy determines bargaining power. Countries that control production dictate the terms of trade. Countries that depend on imports negotiate from weakness. These currencies of negotiation are determined whether you have a very strong industrial base, whether you have industrial sovereignty, whether you do not have it. So if you have it, you negotiate from the point of power. If you don't, you negotiate from the place of weakness. There are currencies, for those that negotiate from a place of weakness, their currencies fluctuate, their industries remain fragile, their development becomes uncertain. Political sovereignty without industrial sovereignty becomes largely very, very symbolic. Flags may fly, the parliaments may meet, but the real levers of power remain elsewhere. Industrial dependency is not only economic, it is psychological. When a society imports most of what it uses, its imagination slowly changes. Young entrepreneurs begin to think like traders rather than inventors. Ambition shifts from designing products to distributing them. The national aspiration becomes commercial rather than technological. Instead of asking how to build machines, people ask how to sell them. Over time, this produces a subtle transformation of culture. Technical confidence weakens, engineering ambitions decline, and entire generations grow up believing that innovation happens elsewhere, somewhere else. Industrial sovereignty, therefore, requires something deeper than policy. It requires a culture that values production, a culture that respects engineers as much as merchants, a culture that rewards technical mastery. In recent decades, many countries have embraced the idea that services alone can sustain prosperity. Finance, tourism, consulting, digital platforms are seen as the future. But this is partly true. This is only mostly true when these systems are designed through industrial sovereignty. But services primarily circulate wealth. Industry creates it. So industrial sovereignty actually is at the backbone of creating wealth for a person as well as for a nation. Without a strong industrial base, services economies become structurally fragile. Trade deficit expands, currencies weaken, employment becomes unstable. Again, employment creeping into this conversation. Without industrial sovereignty, employment is dependent on people. And you can see capital always throwing up these words. If we were to adjust to labor laws here and there, then 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 people will be out of work. And they play this employment card every now and then because the nation is not the owner of that industrial sovereignty. Because if the nation owns its own industrial sovereignty or is industrially sovereign, then you cannot have these things that if capital will throw at you and say, so such and such number of people are going to lose their job or lose their jobs. Because the industrial ownership is now used as a bargaining chip for power. The most powerful economies in the world still maintain deep manufacturing capabilities. Think about that. Countries that produce powerful or useful systems cannot be thrown around in whichever way because they hold manufacturing power. They design chips, build machines, produce energy systems, and manufacture advanced tools. Services flourish most strongly where industry already exists. Industry remains the backbone of durable prosperity. Very, very durable, very, very dependable. And you can really depend on what you produce because you know you are producing it. No one's going to take away that production capacity from you, either as a person or as a nation. And this is where real sovereignty, I don't want to talk about the word independence, but I want you to consider the word sovereignty. This brings us to a difficult question. A continent rich in minerals, what is underground, we talk about it, energy resources, and agricultural land still imports many of finished goods it consumes. So the continent of Africa talks about what is under the ground, what is under the soil, but it doesn't have industrial sovereignty to transform all of these things that it has under the soil, it has in the ground. Raw materials leave the continent, finished goods return at far higher prices. This pattern is not accidental. It reflects the historical structure of global production that has been remarkably persistent. This needs to change. The word independence needs to be abandoned, and the word sovereignty needs to be incorporated into our vocabulary. In previous videos, I've talked about how the word job and employment needs to be deleted from our dictionaries and our grammars and our lived experience, and the word sovereignty needs to be incorporated. Just like now, I'm now saying that the word independence needs to be thrown out and the word sovereignty needs to be brought in. But this future does not have to replicate the past, because in future and in the present, we are going to have sovereignty instead of independence. Industrial sovereignty requires deliberate choices, investment in engineering education, development of manufacturing capacity, control over energy systems, and cultivation of scientific research. On the Solomon Atah podcast, we talk a lot about this. Check it out. Go check out some of those videos about how the cultivation of scientific research is very important to gaining industrial sovereignty. These are not short-term projects. These are generational commitments. When we speak about sovereignty, we often imagine borders, constitution, and national anthems. No, 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 no. But in the 21st century, sovereignty is increasingly industrial. In fact, not increasingly, sovereignty is industrial. Sovereignty is linked to production. It is the ability to design technologies, to manufacture essential goods, to control energy system, to build the infrastructure that sustain modern life. Without these capacities, political independence becomes very fragile. Industrial sovereignty, therefore, begins with a shift in thinking from consumption to production, from distribution to invention, from dependency to capability, because at the end, the hierarchy of the modern world is simply nations that produce shape the future. Nations that only consumes must adapt to that future. Someone else creates a future through industrial production, and you only consume, so you have to adapt to it. And the question every society must answer is this: will we merely participate in the global economy, or will we build the engines that power it? We must adopt industrial sovereignty as a means of creating for ourselves a power, a chip on the negotiating table. I will see you in the next video. Let me know what you think about these ideas of industrial sovereignty. And look at other countries around you. Look at how other economies have developed. Whether have they not anchored themselves through production? Let me know what you think. Please share this video. If you've gained something from this video, if you learned something from this video, share it so that we can build a community around these ideas of sovereignty. I'll talk to you on this channel about books, about the books that we can write, about how we can disseminate knowledge, because now when AI is being built, when LLMs and the large language models are being built, they are going to need all the knowledges that are in our minds in the form of text in order to ingest it in the data sets. We have to consider this very strongly. But let me know what you think about industrial sovereignty for yourself, personal sovereignty for yourself, I beg your pardon, and industrial sovereignty for your country.